the preacher's daughter. The blood on her wedding dress hadn't dried yet when Sarah McKinnon realized she'd married the wrong man. She knelt beside the altar of her father's church, her white silk stained crimson from the wound across her new husband's throat, while the congregation screamed and scattered like startled birds. But it wasn't her husband's blood painting her dress. It was her father's. Reverend Thomas McKinnon lay 3 feet from the altar, his Bible still clutched in his dead hands. The marriage ceremony he'd been performing cut short by a Bowie knife that had opened his neck from ear to ear. The man Sarah had just promised to love and honor stood over her father's body, wiping blood from his blade with her father's own handkerchief. "Sorry you had to see that, darling," Daniel Carrick said, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he'd used during their courtship. "But your daddy knew too much about my business dealings. Couldn't have him spreading gossip on our wedding day." Sarah stared at the man she'd married 60 seconds earlier, understanding finally settling over her like a burial shroud. Daniel hadn't courted her for love. He'd courted her to silence her father permanently, using their wedding as cover for murder. But what Sarah didn't know yet was that her father's death was just the beginning. Daniel Carrick hadn't just married her to kill one preacher who'd learned inconvenient truths. He'd married into a family whose secrets ran deeper than any mine shaft in Colorado, and whose enemies had been planning this wedding day revenge for 15 years. The real question wasn't why Daniel had killed her father. It was why he'd waited so long to do it. To understand that, we need to go back to when Sarah was 13 years old, when her father was just another circuit preacher carrying God's word to mining camps and cattle towns. Back to the day he witnessed something that would eventually cost him his life and make his daughter the most dangerous woman in the Colorado Territory. Broken Creek, Colorado Territory. 1868, 13-year-old Sarah McKinnon sat in the back of their covered wagon, reading her Bible by candlelight while her father prepared his Sunday sermon. The mining camp of Broken Creek sprawled before them in the valley below, lantern light flickering from dozens of crude shacks and tents where men sought their fortunes in played-out silver claims. "Remember what I've taught you about dangerous places, Sarah," Reverend McKinnon called from the driver's bench. "Keep your eyes down, your voice quiet, and trust no one we haven't prayed with." Sarah nodded, though she'd heard these warnings at every mining camp they'd visited during their 3 years of circuit preaching. Her father was cautious by nature, made more so by the responsibility of traveling with a young daughter through territories where law existed only in the barrels of guns and the strength of men's word. But Broken Creek felt different from other camps they'd visited. The men who watched their wagon enter the settlement didn't have the desperate hope she usually saw in miners' faces. They looked prosperous, well-fed, and suspicious of strangers, in a way that suggested they had secrets worth protecting. "Pa," she said, setting aside her Bible, "why are we stopping here? Nobody sent for us." Reverend McKinnon was quiet for a moment, guiding their mules around the worst of the ruts in the muddy street. "Someone did send for us, child, just not in the usual way." Sarah frowned. Usually they received written invitations from mining camp leaders or cattle ranchers who wanted preaching services for their workers. Sometimes they'd be hired to perform weddings or funerals, or to baptize children who'd never seen the inside of a proper church. "What do you mean?" "I received a telegram in Denver 3 days ago. Anonymous, but whoever sent it knew things about Broken Creek that aren't common knowledge." Her father's voice carried an unusual tension. "Things that suggested folks here might need spiritual guidance more than most places." Sarah studied her father's profile in the lantern light. Thomas McKinnon was a gentle man, more comfortable with books and prayers than with the violent realities of frontier life. But something about this anonymous telegram had awakened a different quality in him, a grim determination she'd never seen before. They made camp on the outskirts of Broken Creek, close enough to serve the community but far enough away to avoid the worst of the drinking and gambling that went on after dark. As her father set up their tent, Sarah noticed how carefully he positioned their wagon to provide multiple escape routes, and how he kept his rifle closer than usual. "Pa, what aren't you telling me?" Reverend McKinnon finished driving the tent stakes and turned to face her. In the firelight she could see worry lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. "Sarah, there are some kinds of sin that fester in darkness, growing stronger when good people look away and pretend not to see." He sat beside her on a wooden crate that served as their traveling chair. "Sometimes God calls his servants to shine light into that darkness, even when it's dangerous." "What kind of sin?" "The kind that destroys lives and corrupts souls. The kind that turns men into monsters and makes them forget they were ever made in God's image." Her father opened his Bible to a passage he'd marked with ribbon. "But before we can fight darkness, we have to understand what we're facing." The next morning, Sarah woke to find her father already dressed and preparing to walk into Broken Creek alone. She'd slept poorly, troubled by dreams of shadows and whispered voices that seemed to come from the direction of the mining camp. "Where are you going, Pa?" "To observe, to listen, to understand what we're dealing with before I decide whether to preach here or move on to the next town." He checked his pocket watch, a gift from his congregation back in Ohio, before they started their nomadic ministry. "Stay close to camp, Sarah. Don't talk to anyone unless I'm with you." Sarah spent the morning cleaning their camp and studying her lessons, but her attention kept drifting toward Broken Creek. The mining camp was unusually quiet for mid-morning. No sounds of digging or hauling ore. No voices calling to each other across the workings. It was as if the entire settlement was holding its breath. Around noon, she saw her father returning from town, his face pale and his Bible clutched tightly against his chest. He walked quickly, glancing over his shoulder. Twice before reaching their campsite. "Pack everything," he said without preamble. "We're leaving." "But Pa, I thought we were going to preach here." "Not here. Not this place." Her father began collapsing their tent with shaking hands. "Some darkness is too deep for one man to illuminate, child. Some evil is too organized to fight with sermons and prayers." Sarah had never seen her father retreat from a ministry opportunity, no matter how dangerous or difficult. Whatever he'd discovered in Broken Creek had shaken him to his core. "What did you see?" Reverend McKinnon paused in his packing, looking back toward the mining camp with an expression of profound sadness. "I saw men who've forgotten they have. Souls, Sarah, men who've traded their humanity for silver and convinced themselves they're still doing God's work." As they loaded their wagon and prepared to leave, Sarah caught sight of movement in the rocks above their campsite. 3 men with rifles were watching them from concealment, tracking their movements with the patient attention of hunters observing. "Pray, Pa," she whispered, "we're being watched." Her father didn't look toward the rocks, but his hands moved more quickly as he secured their belongings. "I know that's why we're leaving now, before they decide we've seen too much. But they were too late." As Reverend McKinnon helped Sarah onto the wagon bench, the 3 riflemen emerged from the rocks and began walking toward them with the casual confidence of men who knew their targets couldn't escape. "Afternoon, preacher," called the leader, a tall man with graying hair and expensive clothes that looked out of place in a mining camp. "Heard you were asking questions around town. Curious kind of questions." Reverend McKinnon kept his hands visible and his voice steady. "Just trying to understand the spiritual needs of your community, sir. No harm intended." "No harm intended," the man repeated, smiling coldly. "That's good to hear, because asking the wrong kinds of questions can be harmful to a man's health, especially when he's got a young daughter to think about." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach as the man's gaze shifted to her. She'd seen that look before in the eyes of men who viewed women and children as tools to be used rather than people to be protected. What kind of questions would those be? Her father asked carefully. "Questions about where our silver comes from. Questions about why we don't report all our findings to the Territorial Assay Office. Questions about why certain wagons leave camp at night and don't come back for days. The man stepped closer, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Questions that suggest a preacher might have seen things he wasn't supposed to see. Reverend McKinnon was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him calculating their options. They were 3 miles from the nearest settlement, outnumbered and outgunned, with no one to witness whatever happened next. "I haven't seen anything that would interest territorial authorities," he said finally. "Just men working hard to make honest livings. Honest livings. That's exactly what we're doing, preacher. Honest livings according to our own understanding of what honesty means." The man's smile grew wider. "But sometimes folks from outside don't understand our local customs. Sometimes they get confused about what they've seen and make unfortunate reports to people in Denver or Colorado Springs. I'm not making any reports to anyone." "Of course you're not, because you're a smart man who understands that some knowledge is dangerous to possess." The man gestured toward the other 2 riflemen. "But just to make sure there's no confusion, we're going to ask you to stay in Broken Creek for a few days as our guests." Sarah understood immediately what that meant. They were being taken prisoner, held until the men could decide whether it was safer to let them go or ensure their permanent silence. But her father surprised her by nodding agreement. "We'll be happy to accept your hospitality, won't we, Sarah?" She stared at him, wondering if he'd lost his mind. They had a chance to run, slim though it might be. Why was he agreeing to become prisoners? "Yes, Pa," she said quietly, trusting that he had a plan, even if she couldn't see it. As the rifleman escorted them back toward Broken Creek, Sarah caught her father's eye. He pressed something small and hard into her palm, the key to their strongbox, where he kept their traveling money and his most important papers. She understood. Whatever happened to them, he wanted her to be able to access their resources. He was preparing for the possibility that he might not survive their hospitality in Broken Creek. But what Sarah didn't know was that her father had seen much more than illegal silver mining during his morning reconnaissance. He'd witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life and eventually lead Daniel Carrick to their church altar 15 years later, with murder in his heart. The men of Broken Creek weren't just stealing silver from territorial claims. They were stealing children from nearby settlements, selling them to buyers who valued young workers who could be made to disappear without official investigations. And the man who'd just taken them prisoner was the same Daniel Carrick who would someday court Sarah McKinnon, marry her in her father's church, and kill her father during their wedding ceremony to silence the only witness who could identify him as the leader of the most successful child trafficking operation in the Colorado Territory. But that revelation was still 15 years away. Right now, Sarah was just a 13-year-old girl being marched toward captivity by men who dealt in human lives, unaware that she was about to witness evidence that would make her the most dangerous person in Colorado if she lived long enough to use it. They were housed in a small cabin on the outskirts of Broken Creek, guarded by men who took shifts watching their door. The cabin was clean but sparse, a single room with 2 narrow beds, a small table, and a window that had been nailed shut from the outside. "Pa," Sarah whispered that first night, "what are we going to do?" Reverend McKinnon sat on his bed, reading his Bible by candlelight, but Sarah could see his attention wasn't really on the pages. He was listening to the sounds outside their cabin, cataloging the movements of their guards. "We're going to watch and listen, child. We're going to learn everything we can about what these men are doing. And when the time comes, we're going to bear witness to the truth." "What truth?" Her father closed his Bible and looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, part sadness, part determination, part something that might have been righteous anger. "The truth about what happened to all the children who've gone missing from settlements between here and Denver. The truth about why the territorial government can't seem to track down the men responsible." He blew out the candle, plunging the cabin into darkness. "The truth about why God led us to this place, even though it might cost us our lives." Over the next 3 days, Sarah learned exactly what her father meant From their cabin window, she watched as wagons arrived at night carrying cargo that moaned and cried in young voices. She saw children being led into buildings at the center of town, and she noticed that different children came out than had gone in. The men of Broken Creek were running a trading post for human lives, and they'd perfected their operation over years of practice. Children were brought in from captured wagon trains and raided settlements, held until buyers arrived, then shipped out to mining operations, brothels, and private buyers who valued workers too young to run away or report their captors to authorities. It was systematic, efficient, and protected by corrupt territorial officials who were paid to look the other way whenever reports of missing children crossed their desks. On their fourth night of captivity, Sarah woke to find her father gone. From his bed, she lay still, listening to the sounds outside their cabin, until she heard the soft whisper of his voice from near the window. "Sarah, come here, quietly." She crept across the room and found him kneeling beneath the window, using a small knife to work at the nails, holding it shut. "How did you get that?" "Took it from one of the guards during evening prayers." Told him, "I needed to cut my tobacco." Her father's smile was grim in the moonlight. "Amazing how much trust men will show a preacher, even when they're holding him prisoner." The window came free with a soft creak of wood. Cool night air flowed into the stuffy cabin, carrying with it the sounds of the camp and something else that made Sarah's blood run cold. Children crying. Not the normal sounds of upset or homesickness, but the desperate wails of young voices pushed beyond endurance. "Pa, what are they doing to them? Breaking their spirits? Making them easier to handle during transport?" "Reverend." McKinnon's voice carried a fury Sarah had never heard from him. "But tonight, God willing, we're going to do something about it." He helped her climb through the window, then followed her into the cool Colorado night. The camp was quiet except for the guards' voices and the distant sounds of suffering that seemed to emanate from the buildings at Broken Creek's center. "Where are we going?" "To gather evidence, to document what we've seen, so that someday someone can bring these men to justice." Her father led her toward the largest building in the camp, moving carefully between shadows, and if possible, to help some of those children escape. What happened next would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. They crept close enough to peer through the windows of the main building, and saw dozens of children, some as young as 6, others nearly adult, chained in rows like inventory, awaiting shipment. But worse than the chains were the children's faces. The youngest still showed fear and confusion, but the older ones displayed the hollow emptiness of people who'd given up hope of rescue. They'd learned not to cry, not to struggle, not to hope for anything beyond survival. "My God," her father whispered, "how long has this been going on?" "Long enough to break their spirits," said a voice behind them. "Long enough to make them valuable to the right buyers." They turned to find Daniel Carrick standing behind them with a rifle, his face showing no emotion except mild annoyance at being disturbed during his evening rounds. "Daniel Carrick," her father said, recognizing the man who'd taken them prisoner. "I should have known you were behind this." "Behind it?" "Reverend, I built this operation from nothing. Took me years to establish the supply lines, the distribution network, the political protection." Carrick smiled coldly. "You're looking at the most successful businessman in Colorado Territory. You're looking at a man who's forgotten he has a soul." Carrick laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humanity. "Soul? Reverend, my soul bought me a house in Denver, investments in 3 silver mines, and enough political influence to ensure I'll never see the inside of a territorial prison." He gestured with his rifle toward the building full of children. "Those children are worth more money than most men see in a lifetime. Clean them up, teach them basic skills, and they'll work for 20 years without ever complaining about wages or working conditions." Sarah felt sick listening to him discuss human lives like livestock, but she also felt something else growing inside her chest, a cold, focused rage that surprised her with its intensity. "What happens to us now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she'd expected. Carrick studied her with the same appraising look she'd seen him give the children in chains. "That depends on how smart your father is. He can continue his ministry. Keep traveling from town to town, and never mention what he's seen here, or ... or you kill us," Reverend McKinnon finished. "Killing's messy, Reverend. Draws attention from territorial authorities. Creates investigations that are hard to control." Carrick's smile became predatory. "But accidents happen all the time on the frontier. Wagons overturn, people get lost in blizzards. Sometimes entire families just disappear without a trace." Sarah understood the threat, but she also understood something Carrick didn't. Her father wasn't the kind of man who could witness systematic evil and remain silent about it. He would find a way to expose this operation, regardless of the personal cost. Which meant Carrick would eventually have to kill them both. "I need time to think about your offer," her father said carefully. "This is a big decision." "Of course it is. Take all the time you need, Reverend. But remember, some decisions are permanent, and some mistakes can't be corrected." Carrick escorted them back to their cabin, but Sarah could see that their situation had fundamentally changed. They were no longer prisoners being held for questioning. They were witnesses to a criminal operation, and their knowledge made them liabilities that would eventually have to be eliminated. As they lay in their beds that night, listening to their guards' voices outside the door, Sarah whispered to her father in the darkness, "He's going to kill us, isn't he? Probably, but not right away. He needs time to make our deaths look accidental, and he needs to move those children before anyone comes looking for us." Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about the hollow-eyed children she'd seen chained in the building. "Pa, we can't let this continue. No, child, we can't. But stopping it might cost us our lives." Sarah thought about that as she listened to the distant sounds of children crying in the Colorado night. Her father had taught her that some things were worth dying for: faith, family, protecting the innocent from evil. She'd never really understood what he meant until now. "Then that's what it costs," she said finally. "But we don't let those children suffer because we were too afraid to help them." Reverend McKinnon was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried pride mixed with sorrow. "You're growing up, Sarah McKinnon. Growing into the kind of woman who'll change the world someday if she lives long enough to do it." Neither of them slept much that night. They were too busy planning what might be their last act on Earth, a desperate attempt to free dozens of children and expose a criminal operation that had grown powerful enough to corrupt territorial government itself. But they were also planning something else, though Sarah wouldn't realize it until 15 years later, when Daniel Carrick slid a knife across her father's throat during her wedding ceremony. They were planning revenge that would follow Carrick for the rest of his life, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy everything he'd built from the suffering of innocent children. Sarah McKinnon was about to become the most dangerous kind of enemy Carrick could imagine, one who'd learned his methods, understood his weaknesses, and had nothing left to lose. The escape attempt came 2 nights later, during a thunderstorm that provided cover for movement and noise. Sarah and her father had spent the intervening time studying the camp's routines, memorizing guard positions, and preparing for what would likely be a suicide mission. "Remember," her father whispered, as they prepared to slip through their cabin window, "our job isn't to save everyone. It's to save as many as we can and get word to authorities who might actually do something about this." Sarah nodded, though she had private doubts about finding uncorrupted authorities in territorial government. If Carrick's operation had survived this long, it was because he had protection at the highest levels. They crept through the storm toward the building where the children were held, using lightning flashes to navigate between the guards' positions. The rain and thunder covered the sounds of their movement, but it also made it harder to see potential threats. The building's rear door was secured with a heavy chain, but Reverend McKinnon had prepared for that. Using tools he'd fashioned from cabin hardware, He worked at the chain while Sarah kept watch for guards. "Almost got it," he whispered. Another minute, and the chain fell away with a clatter that seemed impossibly loud despite the storm. Sarah held her breath, waiting for shouts of alarm, but the thunder had masked the sound from the guards. Inside, the building was dark and rank with the smell of unwashed bodies and human waste. Dozens of children huddled on straw bedding, most sleeping fitfully despite the storm. Those who were awake looked up at Sarah and her father with expressions of hope mixed with terror. "We're here to help," Sarah whispered to the nearest group, "but we have to be very quiet." What followed was organized chaos. The youngest children wanted to cry out in relief or fear, while the older ones were suspicious of another adult promise of rescue. Sarah and her father worked systematically, using the knife to cut through chains and ropes, whispering instructions about staying quiet and moving carefully. But they could only move so many children at once, and time was running short. Eventually, the guards would make their rounds and discover the empty building. "Take these 12, her father said, indicating a group of children who seemed most capable of moving quickly and quietly. "Get them to the horses behind Miller's store. I'll come back for the others." "Pa, you can't save them all in one night." "Maybe not, but I can try." His expression was grim but determined. "Sarah, if something happens to me, you get those children to safety and then find someone in Denver who can shut down this operation. Promise me." She wanted to argue, wanted to stay and help him free the remaining children. But she could see the logic in his plan, and she could hear the authority in his voice that brooked no argument. "I promise, Pa." Leading 12 frightened children through a thunderstorm toward uncertain freedom was the hardest thing Sarah had ever done. They moved in single file, her father's stolen horses providing transportation for the youngest, while the others walked beside them through the muddy streets of Broken Creek. Behind them, she could hear shouts beginning to rise from the direction of the children's prison. Their escape had been discovered. "Faster," she whispered to the group. "We have to reach the tree line before they organize a search." But as they approached the edge of town, lanterns began appearing in windows and armed men emerged from buildings. The entire camp was waking up, and soon they'd be surrounded by Carrick's people. "This way," called one of the older children, a boy of perhaps 15 who'd taken charge of helping the younger ones. "There's a ravine behind the assay office. We can follow it out of town." Sarah didn't know the local geography, but the boy had obviously been planning escape routes during his captivity. She decided to trust his knowledge and led the group toward the ravine he'd indicated. They made it to cover just as the first organized search parties began moving through Broken Creek's streets. From the ravine, Sarah could see dozens of lanterns spreading out from the town center, systematically checking every building and shadow where escaped children might be hiding. "What about your pay?" whispered the teenage boy who'd guided them to safety. Sarah looked back toward the building where her father was attempting to free the remaining children. She could see lanterns converging on it from multiple directions, and she could hear shouting that suggested the rescue attempt had turned into a battle. "He knew this might happen," she said quietly. "He made me promise to get you to safety, regardless of what happened to him." They waited in the ravine for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of searching and occasional gunfire from Broken Creek. Sarah kept hoping to see her father emerge from the darkness with another group of children, but as the night wore on, her hope faded into grim certainty. Reverend Thomas McKinnon had sacrificed his life to save as many children as he could. Now it was Sarah's responsibility to honor that sacrifice by getting the survivors to safety and finding authorities who could bring justice to Daniel Carrick and his organization. Just before dawn, sounds of searching began to die down. Sarah made the decision to move the children further from Broken Creek before daylight made them visible to pursuit parties. "Can everyone walk for a few more hours?" she asked the group. The children nodded, too exhausted and traumatized for conversation, but willing to follow anyone who'd proven she was trying to help them. They moved deeper into the mountains, following game trails and creek beds that would make them harder to track. By mid-morning, they'd covered enough ground to risk a rest stop. Sarah found a concealed meadow where the children could sleep while she kept watch and tried to decide their next move. She had no money, limited supplies, and a dozen traumatized children depending on her for survival. Their nearest refuge was probably Colorado Springs, but that was 3 days' travel through country controlled by men who wanted them dead or recaptured. But as Sarah watched the children sleep in the morning sunshine, she realized her father had given her something more valuable than money or supplies. He'd given her knowledge of how Carrick's organization operated, evidence that could bring down the entire criminal enterprise. She just had to survive long enough to use it. The boy who'd guided them to the ravine woke first, looking around the meadow with the alertness of someone who'd learned not to trust apparent safety. "What's your name?" Sarah asked him. "Tommy Briggs. Been in that place for 8 months. He studied her face. "Your pa didn't make it out, did he?" Sarah shook her head, feeling tears threaten for the first time since the escape. "But he saved you. All of you. That has to count for something." Tommy was quiet for a moment, looking at the other children beginning to wake up around them. "It counts for everything, miss. Your pa died so we could be free. That makes him a hero." Sarah felt something hardening inside her chest, not grief but determination. Her father had died fighting evil, and now it was her turn to carry on that fight. At first, she had to get these children to safety, and then she had to find a way to destroy Daniel Carrick and everything he built from the suffering of innocence. She didn't know it yet, but that opportunity would come 15 years later, when Carrick made the mistake of courting a preacher's daughter who'd never forgotten what she'd witnessed in Broken Creek, and who'd spent her adult life preparing for the chance to bring him to justice. The wedding day murder would be Carrick's final mistake, because Sarah McKinnon had learned patience from her father, ruthlessness from necessity, and justice from watching evil men prosper while good people died. But that reckoning was still years away. Right now, she was just a 13-year-old girl, leading a group of rescued children toward an uncertain future, carrying evidence that could reshape territorial law enforcement if she lived long enough to present it. The journey to Colorado Springs took 5 days, moving carefully through country where Carrick's people might be searching for escaped children. Sarah rationed their meager supplies, found water and shelter, and kept the group moving despite exhaustion and the younger children's fears. Tommy Briggs proved invaluable as a guide and protector, his 8 months of captivity having taught him survival skills that complemented Sarah's wilderness knowledge. Together they managed to bring all 12 children safely to the outskirts of Colorado Springs. But arriving at civilization presented new challenges. Sarah had no legal authority over the children, no way to prove their identities or explain their circumstances without revealing knowledge that might get them all killed. Her solution was characteristically direct and morally clear. She walked into the Colorado Springs Sheriff's Office with all 12 children and demanded to speak with someone who could contact federal authorities about child trafficking in territorial mining camps. What followed changed the trajectory of law enforcement in Colorado Territory. Sarah's testimony, supported by physical evidence she'd memorized during their captivity, triggered the largest federal investigation in territorial history. Within 6 months, Carrick's operation was shut down and dozens of corrupt officials were facing federal charges. But Carrick himself disappeared before he could be arrested, taking with him enough money and political connections to rebuild his criminal empire elsewhere. The investigation had damaged him, but not destroyed him, and Sarah knew he would eventually resurface with new methods and new victims. She spent the next 15 years preparing for that day, using her father's connections in religious communities to build a network of information and influence that stretched across 3 territories. She became exactly what her father had trained her to be, a witness for truth and a protector of the innocent. When Daniel Carrick finally reappeared in her life as a suitor seeking marriage, Sarah McKinnon was ready for him. She'd learned his weaknesses, understood his methods, and prepared a trap that would ensure he could never hurt another child. The wedding ceremony where he murdered her father was meant to be his, triumphs silencing the last witness who could connect him to the Broken Creek operation. Instead, it became his downfall, because Sarah had spent 15 years planning exactly how to destroy him completely and permanently. But that confrontation was still hours away from the blood-soaked altar where she now knelt, understanding finally why Daniel Carrick had courted her so patiently, and why he'd chosen their wedding day to settle his accounts with the past. Now she had to decide whether to be the helpless victim he expected, or the dangerous enemy her father had trained her to become. The choice would determine whether justice finally came to Daniel Carrick, or whether he would add her name to the long list of people who died trying to expose his crimes. Sarah McKinnon looked down at her father's blood on her wedding dress and felt 15 years of patient preparation crystallizing into cold, focused rage. She'd promised her father she would find authorities who could bring justice to the men who destroyed so many lives. Now she was going to become that authority herself. But first, she had to survive long enough to spring the trap she'd been preparing for half her lifetime. The congregation had fled, leaving Sarah alone in the church with her new husband and her father's body. Daniel Carrick cleaned his knife methodically, showing no emotion about the murder he just committed during their wedding ceremony. "I suppose you're wondering why I waited so long," he said conversationally. "Why I didn't just kill your father years ago when the federal investigation first started causing problems." Sarah didn't answer, but she kept her hands visible and her posture non-threatening. She needed him to keep talking, needed him to reveal information she could use against him. "The truth is, I rather enjoyed the game. Your father spent 15 years trying to gather evidence against me, building his little network of informants and witnesses." Carrick smiled coldly. "I spent 15 years corrupting his informants and eliminating his witnesses. It was almost sporting." "Almost?" "Well, the sport ended when he started planning to testify before that Senate committee next month. Federal investigation of territorial corruption, with your dear father as the star witness." Carrick sheathed his knife and straightened his coat. "I couldn't allow that, obviously." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. She'd known her father was corresponding with federal investigators, but she hadn't known he was scheduled to testify before Congress. His murder wasn't just personal revenge, it was Carrick protecting a criminal empire that reached into the federal government itself. "So you courted me to get close to him." "I courted you because killing a preacher during his daughter's wedding creates the perfect emotional narrative. Grieving widower loses his mind, murders his new son-in-law and father-in-law in a fit of jealous rage, then kills himself in remorse." Carrick's smile was genuinely amused. "The newspapers will love the story." Sarah understood the plan now. Carrick intended to kill her and stage the scene to look like a murder-suicide, eliminating both potential witnesses while creating a scandal that would overshadow any federal investigation. "Except I'm not a grieving widower yet," she pointed out. "No, but you will be in about 30 seconds. Carrick drew a second knife from his coat. "I'm sorry it has to end this way, Sarah. You're actually quite intelligent, and in different circumstances, I might have enjoyed being married, too." "You." Sarah looked around the church, calculating distances and options. The front door was too far away, and Carrick was between her and the side exits. Her only chance was the vestry behind the altar, but she'd have to get past her father's body and hope the door wasn't locked. "Before you kill me," she said, "I'd like to know something. The children from Broken Creek, what happened to them after the federal investigation?" Carrick paused, knife halfway raised. Curious question for someone about to die. Curious answer for someone who's already committed murder in a church. He laughed, genuinely delighted by her nerve. "Most of them were returned to their families, though some had been sold too far away to trace. A few died during the investigation. Tragic accidents, of course. And Tommy Briggs? Carrick's expression sharpened. How do you know? That name? Sarah smiled, and for the first time since her father's murder, she felt hope flowing back into her chest. Tommy Briggs is the reason you're about to die, Daniel. Carrick's knife hand tensed. What are you talking about? Tommy survived your little accidents during the federal investigation. More than survived, he thrived. Became a federal marshal, actually. Spent the last 10 years tracking down everyone connected to the Broken Creek operation. Sarah took a small step toward the vestry door. He's been watching you for months, Daniel. Watching and waiting for you to make exactly this kind of mistake. You're lying. Am I? Then why don't you look behind you? Carrick spun around, and in that moment of distraction, Sarah lunged for the vestry door. It opened under her hand, revealing not an empty room but a tall man in a federal marshal's badge who'd been waiting in concealment. "Hello, Daniel," Tommy Briggs said, his Colt already drawn and aimed. "Been a long time since Broken Creek." The knife fell from Carrick's nerveless fingers as he stared at the boy, who'd grown into the man now pointing a gun at his heart. "Tommy Briggs, I thought you were dead. You tried hard enough to make it true. 3 assassination attempts over. The years plus bribing territorial officials to transfer me away from cases involving your operations." Tommy's voice was calm, professional, but Sarah could see the 15-year-old boy's pain still burning in his eyes. "But I'm harder to kill than the children you murdered." Sarah stepped away from both men, giving Tommy a clear field of fire, while keeping herself out of the line of potential violence. Her wedding dress was still stained with her father's blood, but she felt stronger than she had since entering the church. "Sarah wrote to me 6 months ago," Tommy continued, his gun never wavering from Carrick's chest. "Told me about your courtship, your marriage proposal, your sudden interest in her father's activities. We've been planning this trap ever since." Carrick's eyes flicked between Tommy and Sarah, understanding finally settling over his features. "The wedding was bait." "The wedding was justice," Sarah corrected. "You murdered my father 15 years ago when you killed those children at Broken Creek. Today you just made it official." "And illegal," Tommy added. "I now have a witness to premeditated murder plus 15 years of documented evidence about your other crimes. Daniel Carrick, you're under arrest for the murder of Reverend Thomas McKinnon and about 40 other people." Carrick looked around the church, calculating his options. The front door was blocked by Tommy's position. The side exits were too far away, and Sarah controlled access to the vestry. He was trapped in the same building where he'd thought to commit the perfect crime. "You know I'll never make it to trial," he said finally. "Too many powerful people have too much invested in keeping me quiet." "Maybe," Tommy agreed, "but you'll make it to a federal prison where your powerful friends won't be able to protect you from the other inmates. Child killers don't do well in prison, Daniel." Sarah watched the exchange with grim satisfaction, but she also felt something else, pity, for the man who'd become so twisted by greed and power that he'd forgotten his own humanity. He looked older than his years, worn down by decades of violence and corruption. "Why children, Daniel? You could have stolen money, robbed banks, even killed adults who could fight back. Why did you choose to hurt children?" Carrick was quiet for a long moment, staring at the blood on the altar where Reverend McKinnon had died. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suggested the weight of his crimes had grown heavier over the years. "Because children were profitable, because they couldn't fight back effectively, because society didn't protect them the way it protected adults." He looked up at Sarah. "Because I discovered I could do it and get away with it. So I kept doing it until it became normal. And now? Now I'm tired, Sarah. Tired of running. Tired of killing people who get too close to the truth. Tired of looking over my shoulder for federal marshals and vengeful relatives." Carrick's shoulders sagged. "Maybe prison will be a relief." Tommy kept his gun trained on Carrick while reaching for his handcuffs. "Daniel Carrick, by the authority of the United States Marshal Service, You're under arrest for murder, kidnapping, child trafficking, and conspiracy to corrupt territorial government." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Sarah felt a chapter of her life closing. The patient, careful girl who'd spent 15 years preparing for this moment was gone, replaced by a woman who'd witnessed justice finally catching up with evil. But she also knew this was just the beginning. Carrick's organization was larger than one man, and his corruption had spread throughout territorial government. Destroying him was important, but dismantling the system that had protected him would require much more work. "Tommy," she said as he prepared to escort Carrick from the church, "what happens now?" "Now we use his testimony to roll up the rest of his organization. Federal prosecutors are already preparing cases against everyone connected to the Broken Creek operation." Tommy smiled grimly. "Your father's testimony won't be needed for the Senate committee, but his documentation will be. This is going to trigger the biggest cleanup of territorial corruption in American history." Sarah looked down at her blood-stained wedding dress, then at her father's body lying beside the altar. "And justice for the children who died. Justice for everyone who died because of Daniel Carrick's greed. Your father, the children at Broken Creek, the witnesses who were murdered over the years. They'll all be remembered as heroes who died, fighting corruption." As Tommy led Carrick toward the church door, the man who'd murdered her father on her wedding day turned back to look at Sarah one final time. "You know, if circumstances had been different, you would have made an interesting partner in business. You have exactly the kind of intelligence and ruthlessness I always looked for in associates." Sarah considered his words for a moment, then shook her head. "The difference between us, Daniel, is that I use my intelligence and ruthlessness to protect children, not exploit them. That makes all the difference in the world." Carrick nodded slowly, as if finally understanding something that had eluded him for decades. "Yes, I suppose it does." After they left, Sarah stood alone in her father's church, surrounded by the wreckage of what should have been her wedding day. Her dress was stained with blood, her husband was under arrest for murder, and her father lay dead beside the altar where he'd spent years preaching about justice and redemption. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced since she was 13 years old, watching her father sacrifice his life to save kidnapped children in a Colorado mining camp. She felt the deep satisfaction that comes from seeing evil finally face consequences for its actions. Her father had taught her that some things were worth dying for. Today, she'd learned that those same things were worth living for, worth dedicating your entire life to protecting and defending. Sarah McKinnon walked to the altar and knelt beside her father's body, saying a prayer of gratitude for the man who'd taught her that truth and justice were more important than safety or comfort. Then she stood up, walked out of the church, and began planning the next phase of her war against the forces that preyed on innocent children. Because Daniel Carrick was just one man in a larger organization, and there were still children out there who needed someone to fight for them. Sarah McKinnon had spent 15 years preparing to destroy one criminal. Now she was going to spend the rest of her life destroying the system that had created him. 6 months later, the trials began in Denver's federal courthouse. Daniel Carrick's testimony, given in exchange for life in prison instead of execution, exposed a network of corruption that reached from mining camps to the territorial capital. 47 people were indicted, including judges, politicians, law enforcement officials, and business leaders who'd profited from child trafficking and systematic fraud. Sarah McKinnon testified as the government's star witness, her 15 years of careful documentation providing the evidence needed to secure convictions. She'd kept every letter her father had written, every piece of evidence he'd gathered, every name and date and financial transaction that connected Carrick's organization to territorial government. But more importantly, she'd kept alive the memory of the children who died in Broken Creek and dozens of other locations where Carrick's people had operated. Each victim was named during the trials, their stories told in open court, their brief lives honored as part of the permanent record of American justice. The trials lasted 8 months, and resulted in convictions for everyone except 2 defendants, who died under suspicious circumstances before they could testify. The territorial government was restructured under federal oversight, and new laws were passed to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had allowed Carrick's organization to flourish. Tommy Briggs was promoted to Chief U.S. Marshal for Colorado Territory with specific responsibility for investigating crimes against children. Sarah McKinnon was offered a position with the Justice Department, helping to establish the first federal task force focused on child protection. She accepted the offer and moved to Washington, where she spent the next 20 years building the legal framework that would eventually become the foundation for federal child protection services. Her work led to the prosecution of hundreds of criminals and the rescue of thousands of children from situations similar to what she'd witnessed at Broken Creek. Daniel Carrick died in federal prison in 1891, stabbed by another inmate who'd heard about his crimes against children. His death was ruled a prison altercation, and no one was ever charged with his murder. Sarah McKinnon never married again. She devoted her life to the children she'd promised her father she would protect, and to building a system of justice that could prevent future Daniel Carricks from exploiting society's most vulnerable members. When she died in 1923, at the age of 68, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been saved or changed by her work. Many of them were former victims of child trafficking, who'd grown up to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, and parents themselves. The inscription on her tombstone, chosen by Tommy Briggs and the other survivors of Broken Creek, reads simply, "Sarah McKinnon, she kept her promise." But perhaps the most fitting memorial was the federal law passed the year after her death, establishing permanent funding for child protection services and creating harsh penalties for anyone who exploited children for profit. The Sarah McKinnon Act became the foundation for modern child protection in America, ensuring that her father's sacrifice and her life's work would continue protecting innocent lives long after she was gone. The preacher's daughter had grown up to become exactly what her father had trained her to be, a witness for truth, a protector of the innocent and living proof that sometimes justice takes a generation to arrive, but when it comes, it changes the world forever.